Welcome to The Choice, Episode 14, Whiteness Conspiracy Theory, The Economics of Whiteness, Part 2, The Infographic. I'm Kurt Doolittle. The National Museum of African American History and Culture has produced an infographic explaining whiteness. Strangely enough, it correctly lists at least most of the properties of white or European civilization, but it treats them as arbitrary and relative by not explaining why those properties exist. So to provide that explanation and to end the pretense of cultural relativism, let's go through the science of mankind and explain how whiteness conforms to it, and in doing so, explain the uncomfortable truth about the superiority of, quote, whiteness. The primary difference between racial and subracial groups is the degree of domestication. The degree of domestication is neotonic. Neoteny slows and limits aggression and retains youthful rates of cooperation and adaptation. Neotenic evolution is largely developmental. It slows the rate of gestation, the rate of maturity, the age of first reproduction, the frequency of sex, and the depth of maturity, and of course the emergence of aggression. Neoteny is possible only by isolation. Neoteny increased as isolated groups adapted to northern climates. It results in a bias to the female racial form, flat faces, the retention of childlike phenotype, meaning features. Europeans cheated a bit by asymmetric reproduction, retaining a large physical size and strength, but fully integrating light-colored eyes, light-colored skin, and various light-colored hair, all signals of neoteny, while not necessarily being so neotenous, thus signaling greater physical neoteny than was present. East Asians are by far the most domesticated and have retained childhood fat distribution, limited scent, very limited sexual maturity, smaller size, and lower aggression. South Asians, today's Islamic civilization, or Southwest Asians, depending on how you do it, I can't classify them all together, retains its origins as an Afro-Asiatic people, as more aggressive, tribal, clannish, or less adaptive. The Iranic people are Arabized, but more domesticated and slightly less aggressive. The Indian people are an admixture of different generations of peoples from the Iranic region, although we must understand that the Persian Gulf area, which flooded before the time of the first invention of agriculture, is likely the origin of all Eurasians, or the Eurasian Urheimat. Unfortunately, that archaeological record is underwater and presently lost to us. The secondary difference between racial and subracial groups is the degree of eugenics that the civilization has imposed on the underclasses versus those that have done the opposite, basically the Europeans and the Chinese. African diversity is touted as a good thing, but it makes an isolation and expression of novelties extremely difficult, especially since Africa selects for rapid maturity to defeat the disease gradient and subsistence survival. The Middle East has been dysgenic since the first religions were developed and priests and states could tax them. The Europeans and East Asians, however, practiced environmental eugenics, agrarian eugenics, credit eugenics, and manorialism in particular that culled the lower classes, raising the average ability of the people to where literacy in machines, craftsmanship, and complex divisions of labor were possible, with the Chinese mastering state bureaucracy and the Europeans mastering rule of law and market society. For the purpose of this discussion, let's recall that European manorialism denies access to farmland without being married and judged of good character, and that the difference between serfs who are limited self-responsibility and only protected by manorial law, and freemen who are protected by common law of men of good character, and the nobility who are protected by imperial law, provided a path to reproductive success, but constrained the reproduction of the unproductive, and that those who were insufficiently productive would starve. Furthermore, capital punishment escalated dramatically after 1200, which is about the time of the emergence of the new European civilization. In other words, the miracle of the new European civilization begins around 1000. And as I've humorously stated elsewhere, we have to hang about 1,000 people every day to equal the degree of suppression of bad folk during the high and late medieval period. That was a period of genetic pacification, as we call it. The Chinese are actually far more brutal, with less respect for human life, and the symbol of law in China was the axe for cutting off heads, not the scale or gavel, something I found interesting when studying Mongol jungle history. As we discussed in my previous episode on whiteness, European civilization is the most adaptive in time because it never violates or is in least violation of the formal physical and natural and evolutionary laws of the universe, and it does so least of all human civilizations. And this produces disproportionate rates of discovery, innovation, and adaptation in time, with the least social political impediment constantly forcing the population to adapt along with its discoveries. With the American experiment, the most complete of those attempts. But as I've stated here and elsewhere, just as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were revolts against reason and empiricism and European domestication in the ancient world, Jewish Marxism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, anti-male feminism, and Darwinian HBD denialism are pseudoscientific reformations of the Jewish revolt against reason and empiricism and conformity to the laws of the universe. And elsewhere, I've described the Abrahamic technique of delay, deceive, and undermining, using faith, healing, false promise, baiting into hazard, and undermining to destroy these advanced civilizations from within. So the European strategy is pretty simple, really: the continuation of natural selection by the reciprocal grant of and insurance of self-determination, sovereignty, and reciprocity, and the obligation for truth and duty to the commons. In other words, it's a shareholder agreement between warriors. Since there's no authority in such a system that isn't granted to people, each other, by the shareholders, there's no authority but the law of shareholders. There's self-determination by self-determined means under sovereignty, reciprocity, truth, and duty. This leaves no possible means of survival other than productivity, voluntary exchange, in an adversarial market for seizing opportunities for exchange. And those that can't compete are held as slaves or serf, or finally given freedom as freemen, and then the opportunity for sovereignty, meaning citizenship, if they are successful enough. Given this explanation, European civilization is quite simple. It's the only one that doesn't try to escape the necessity of continuing natural selection by use of markets. The unstated presumption is the primacy of man. In other words, one of the things we don't realize in our European sensibility is that we're actually advocating for the primacy of man, whereas the Semitic religions are advocating for the primacy of the gods. So we transcend God. We transcend and seek to be or replace gods, and they seek to be submit to them. So the unstated presumption is the primacy of man, not gods, that gods are only competitors, that man can not only defeat gods, but evolve into them. So the mission of Western man is the transcendence of man into gods by the discovery, adaptation to, and application of the laws of nature and nature's God. It's this mission that the Christians sought to destroy by undermining the aristocracy and bringing Semitic dysgenics into the Roman Empire. The only reason it didn't quite succeed, again, as I said elsewhere, the aristocracy captured the church, used it as a holding company, and I'll give more on that later and elsewhere if I have to. But the Catholic Church today is reverting, as I said, to third world communist form, which are its natural Semitic incentives now that Europeans have abandoned it. So the point we're coming to is that all groups of necessity are ethnocentric, meaning racist. Europeans are the least ethnocentric to their detriment. Yes, that's true, sorry. Other groups without similar demographic compositions and similar genetic adaptations cannot compete in our civilization and will not and cannot adapt because they are unfit for the high personal and group costs of competing in an advanced, high-trust, low-corruption eugenic civilization that has limited divergence from formal physical, natural, and evolutionary laws. These groups want the benefits without the high cost of integration and the much higher in-group cost of self-domestication of their underclasses by equally soft eugenic reproduction practiced by Europeans for millennia. And while we experience a few centuries of windfall from the European advances relative to other people, we no longer have that technological advantage, especially given our smaller numbers. And as such, our quality of life is dependent entirely on our one remaining advantage, our demographic composition and a retention of our high trust norms that these people seek to undermine and destroy from within. So now we have a little context. Let's go through the whiteness infographic and explain it. At the first it says rugged individualism. Well, what this is natural selection. The individual is the primary unit. Yes, we grant people self-determination by sovereignty and reciprocity if they can survive in the market. If they aren't, then they're not fit for freedom and citizenship. They either have to be gone, they have to be caretaken for, and if they're caretaken for, their reproduction has to be limited. Family structure. The nuclear family, father and mother, 2 to 3 children is the ideal social unit. Husband and this is all simple economics. The nuclear family is part of the domestication of us under manorialism, which means a husband and wife of good character to raise a family and maintain a farm. And you can't be sure then we need to deprive them of land so they can't reproduce. So we'll give land to better people instead, and those people need to be taken care of by their families or by this church or by the manor instead, because they're not sufficiently capable to be independent and have choice. Emphasis on the scientific method. Well, again, it's objective rational. There's no difference between science and our law, because our law is just science. Our culture is just science. There's no difference between the natural world, the laws of the universe, our law, and the testimony we give and the behavior we demonstrate in society. It's just science. That's what we do. The reason we do that and other people don't is that it's very costly to adhere to the testimonial speech, the scientific method, reciprocity, and the natural, physical, and evolutionary laws. Yeah, our history is based on Northern immigrant experience. It's actually as much Germanic as it was English. You have to address that in another talk. It's coming on soon. And that's because almost everything great that's ever happened in the world happened here. And it happened in very short periods in the ancient world and the modern world, with the Jewish and Christian and Islamic Dark Age in the middle, causing the only negative period in our growth. It looks like the Greeks would have hit the Industrial Revolution before the year 100 if we hadn't crossed the Bosphorus and brought the Semitic infection into Europe. The Protestant work ethic. Again, the Protestant work ethic is just a manorial work ethic. You can't have a house.
You can't reproduce. You can't take responsibility for the commons. You can't be trusted to do no harm. You can't be trusted as freemen who adhere to the common ancestral laws. And you can't be trusted to invest in the commons and preserve those commons rather than to capture for yourself and family.
You understand there's manorial law. In other words, the law of the manor means you are owned by the nobility.
So the manor takes responsibility for preventing your harms.
Once you're a free man, you have access to the common law, which means you're free, you're a responsible citizen, you're not going to harm anybody, you're going to adhere to you're going to do your duty for the commons. And so when we say it's a Protestant work ethic, it just means that you're demonstrating manorial ethic. If you look at the Hainal line, it's spelled Hajnal. If you look at the Hainal line, you'll see that's where manorialism spread across Europe. You'll see it looks a lot like the Holy Roman Empire of Germany.
So it's the Northern and Central European strategy of domesticating people incrementally so that they can continue to capitalize and create commons, because commons are a way of shared returns on investments.
Just like when the American founders came here, the Puritans were very concerned. They were recruiting only people of good character. In other words, only people capable of the Protestant work ethic were capable of not pushing burden onto others. So one of the things they were escaping wasn't just the monarchy. It was also the church, which was corrupt, and they were trying to escape the peasants, who were also a dead weight. So they were trying to create what we would think of, and they didn't have a word for it, as a middle-class society. People of good character who were capable of continuing the European tradition.
Now, as for Christianity...
Yes, Christianity is the norm, but then again, we Germanicized Christianity, and while it's hostile to a European way of life, that's the churchy part. If you look at just what Jesus said, it's a recipe for those people who aren't able to demonstrate merit to have self-image and social status, not because they can compete in the market, not because that they are good warriors, not because they're politically capable, but because they don't do wrong.
I can't emphasize enough how Christianity allowed us to domesticate ourselves like we had conquered and domesticated others.
And this is really important, how what Christianity did. It's the eradication of hatred from the human heart, the extension of kinship love to others, the exhaustion of forgiveness before retribution, and the requirement for personal acts of charity. I mean, that's Christianity right there. If you do those things, you will produce a high trust polity. And it was the reason it worked. It was the only way for those people that were in the lower classes to have any status, because the European civilization conquers and domesticates people like herd animals. And that's what the slave serf freeman citizen hierarchy was for. And so if you couldn't do that, you were
unfit for the herd, too costly to train.
well, and frankly, if you look at religion and law, it really worked that way. So what Christianity does, it gave people a way to be good.
A way that they too could earn respect by contributing to the commons.
It gave people to be proud, to have self-image, to build community, and to build the commons. So when we brought Christianity over, we Germanicized it.
And then,
after 1000, started to build the structure of European economy back. Then we had this ability to create a very high quality working class, laboring class. Even if they weren't basically peasants, they were still a high quality class. And so this really worked help. And this is why when Christianity goes to any civilization, we're a little less troubled about it. Islam causes dysgenia, violence, decline, but Christianity creates trust. And the reason we want trust is the opposite of Islam. It creates whatever it does, but doesn't create trust. It's the most untrustworthy people in the world or in the Middle East. What it does create is it's exhaustive forgiveness. It does the opposite of tribalism. It makes everybody kin, and it makes everybody kin without too many falsehoods. So Christianity, the reason we're tolerant of Christianity is because it's compatible with our civilization. The church tried to indoctrinate people, tried to incorporate natural law. The church tried to incorporate Aristotle at least twice. So we know that the church tried to harmonize the
church's authoritarian, submissive, dysgenic dogma with the traditional aristocratic eugenic strategy.
But they failed because it's basically incompatible. What is compatible is the teachings of Jesus Christ and what it does for people and how that helps people fit into the civilization. Status, power, and authority. Wealth equals worth.
Demonstrated contribution of capital to the common good and demonstrated non-imposition of costs on the commons is your worth. So do good and do no harm. Pay your own way.
Your job is who you are. Yes, your job and your contribution to the commons is who you are. Europeans are an army, whether we're an army as a militia under the aristocracy, an army in the commons defending our commons, an army as a workforce. We're just armies, and all you have to do is do your duty, and you get respect for it if you do your duty. That's it, just like an army. It doesn't matter where you are in the hierarchy. So when you look at our society, most peoples can't do this. They can't compete in the market. They won't pay the costs of integrating into the society. They won't be satisfied with doing their duty, and instead they're more aggressive, so they want to status climb without any merit for it. It really bothers them to be at a position. But if you notice with white males, we don't care where we are as long as we're good for doing our duty. That's what makes European civilization different.
Our emphasis on time.
Yes, well, time is a commodity. It's your productivity in time. It's an intersection of multiple factors, one of which is how trustworthy you are, another was which you are actually working. We have a real hatred of people who are slackers. And so time is one of the ways you demonstrate to people that you can be depended on and that you're not a slacker. Our aesthetic, art history, art's my first specialty, is really a technical discipline. It's a craft like any other. The meaning it conveys is an addition to the craftsmanship, and European art progressed very, very quickly for very specific reasons because, again, we're more scientific and technical by our nature. The holidays, of course, that's what they are, and really we don't really practice too many holidays. When I lived in Eastern Europe, I really liked it. If you live in Western Ukraine, you basically get Catholic holidays, you get Orthodox holidays, and you get the remaining Soviet holidays. And I was like, Ukraine's wonderful. Not only are the people the sweetest in the world, and they're the only poor white people left in the world, and they're all one generation off the farm, so they're generally pretty sweet, and they get a lot of holidays, and so family and friends is still traditional. I really love it there. Justice, again, is based on the English common law, but that doesn't tell us much. The American law is a version of the English common law. The English common law is a version of Germanic traditional law. Germanic traditional law is a version of late Indo-European traditional law. So our law is our foundation of our civilization, and it's this common law that makes us sovereign. So when I tell people, well, Americans are the only people that live under rule of law because only our law is sovereign. If you go to England, the parliament is sovereign. If you go into the continental, Napoleon ruined Europe, then he imposed this damn legal system on it, which states what you can do as well as you can't do. So they don't have their common law. So the state's sovereign, not the people, not the law, not the court. The state is whatever they come up with, they can direct you to, and you're supposed to trust them that they're doing the moral thing. Americans are sovereign. We're still Indo-Europeans. We still have a constitution of natural law. Now, the left has been, the Jewish left in particular, has been attempting to take this away from us for 150 years, because when they came here after the Second World War, they tried to bring the Bolshevik and Marxist revolutions here and repeat what they'd done in Germany and in Russia. But they came here once they were ousted in Europe, and they've been practicing the same project here. They've been really successful, but it's the same technique, and that's why my law is so important, is it makes the kind of lies they tell illegal, just like any other commercial or fraud. Justice competition, yeah, it's the same thing. Well, that's, again, you look at sport, adversarialism, there's no authority. There's only demonstrated excellence. So there's nobody to give you anything. There's nobody to appeal to. You can only compete and win. So that's why you have the jury. That's why we have in court, we have markets, we have sports, we had jousting, we had gladiatorial combats. We have all these adversarial means because they're an opportunity for you to show that you're fantastic and heroic, and they're a way to filter out and keep out those people who are unwilling to work hard for the commons at self-sacrifice. Majority rules, this isn't quite right. Originally under our law, king or the monarchies, the Christian monarchies, I don't want to go back through the entire history, but they were regulated by the traditional law. So this is when they tried to bring the divine right of kings in, they were trying to overcome that law, that traditional law, so they could do things that the peasants that didn't, or the ordinary people that didn't want. It's the same thing with the Jewish revolt against our law. The people who are trying to enact positive law, it's called positive law. Positive law is just the same thing as under democracy as the divine right of kings. And so they're trying to find some ways to say we're legitimate in imposing this law. But under the common law, the law is sovereign. And nothing can be beyond the law. And under that law, every man is sovereign. So we get to say, I ascend or don't. So instead of having a parliament that was in charge, the parliament could veto. So just like a jury, I can say I won't convict or I will. The parliament was like a jury. It's like the thing was before. The idea was that you can veto. So if the king brought up something was wrong, you could say no. And so when you say the majority rules, it's the majority can veto. What happened during the Enlightenment was the French idea that we should have popular control, and it's turned out not to be a very good idea. The reason is that, like everyone in history has said, is democracy's a race to the bottom. The end result is communism. There's nothing you can do about it. It will turn into totalitarianism. There will be a civil war, and it will start with monarchy again. Well, that's what's going to happen. It's what's happening today. It's because the Jews have never been successful at building their own society. They've only been successful as a parasitic group within other societies. And so they brought this idea, what they call a revolutionary, but it's really a seditious spirit. They brought their seditious spirit with them and tried to undermine our law. They've been very good at it because they are exceptional at rhetoric, and they have an incredible number. They have a disproportionate number of people over 140 for their population. So in that sense, it's not the majority rules. It's that there's always been a hierarchy of you get to say what you have demonstrated expertise for. What universal democracy was done is so they could tax people because the population pool was growing and that people were getting involved in work and the state wanted to capture the taxes. So they gave voting to everybody. What they should have done, what we had always done in history, is make new houses. So when we franchised women have a reproductive strategy that's completely antagonistic to the male and vice versa. So it should have given women their own house so that men and women could vote. Instead of destroying the Senate and making the House a universal parliament, we should have created a house for the working classes, and so that we maintained the aristocratic or money classes, the middle classes, as the house, and created a lower house for the laboring people and a house possibly for women, so that we had some way for the classes to conduct trades instead of racing to the bottom. Because what's happened is, instead of conducting truthful trades inside of the state, what we're doing is we're lying to each other in vast numbers during the 20th century outside of the condition of government in order to try to lie to enough people to get them to vote for our way. So it's just created this incredibly deceitful polity that's destroyed our internal coherence and trust. Moreover, the wealthier the people get, the more they pursue their natural instincts. So we have people, just as we've had in the past, that are more churchy, and that means they're more leftist, and we have people that are more military, and they're more rightist. this. And frankly, we're pretty evenly distributed right now. The only solution to this is separation, because when we're wealthy enough to chase our own expectations, our own wants, and our wonder, when we can exercise our political preferences, we do. And so we're demonstrating that we're incompatible. So just as in every other point in human history, when we're incompatible, we separate. Some people leave, other people migrate, whatever happens. We're in a position where we have to split. So, avoid complex intimacy. Yeah. Again, I want to hit a few things on communication. King's English rules. Yes, that's correct, because English is a legal language, a legal and scientific language. That's why it's different from German, which is a psychological or engineering language. French, it's a political language, or Italian, it's a romantic or aesthetic language. So English is the reason, we're really good at inventing law and science. It's partly our language. So imagine if you're in China, how hard it is to do the same thing when almost everything's analogistic instead of specific. So the same thing is our written tradition. Our written tradition follows science and contracts and literature, and it's very precise, and we avoid conflict because we are trying to keep things on a rational basis. Not showing emotion, not discussing personal life. These are means for large numbers of people who are in different classes from different backgrounds to cooperate like they do in a market, to do it in social and political life as well. So this is how we scale. The problem is people want to be able to use emotional manipulation, make appeals to empathy, use sophistry and deceit, and it's very hard if we maintain whiteness as our culture. So once you sort of, I could go on and on and on, but the point here is that that this white chart, it doesn't bring it back to, these are what whiteness represents. They are science. In other words, whiteness is science. Science is the natural law. Europeans discovered, adapted to the natural law, and we didn't do it on purpose, completely by accident, and we've paid the price of that by reducing the size of the underclasses consistently, and we have done it by forcing each other, by use of our law and our traditions, to incrementally suppress all those means that are possible of begging, deceiving, free riding, whatever. We've pushed people out in order to maintain market eugenics. Doesn't seem pleasant, but it's what it is, and it's the reason for our success. This is Kurt Doolittle for The Choice. Thank you for listening.